So today I am very happy to have a special guest with me, Tom Shillue. He's a comedian, host of the Quiz Show on Fox Nation, and author of Mean Dads for a Better America. Thank you for joining me today.
I am truly a mean dad. Thanks, Joe.
So let's get right into it. My first question is, what are the differences, in your opinion, being a content creator or journalist at a smaller news outlet, such as a city newspaper, when compared with being a content creator or journalist at a major mainstream news company like Fox?
Yeah, I would say obviously differences are night and day. In the old world, I think in the old days, almost all media was local. You know, you had your local newspaper, you read it, you found out what was going on. I know when I was a kid, the national news, ABC, CBS, NBC, and then the PBS station, those were for grown-ups. They always talked about presidents and world affairs and all this stuff. I was not interested. I would, junior high, high school, when I first started getting interested in the news, I would pick up the Norwood newspaper. That was my hometown, Norwood, Massachusetts. And then when I wanted the bigger picture, I would pick up the Boston Globe. But it was all very Massachusetts. I mean, most of the news I was consuming at the time, I can remember in the early 80s, we were talking about the governor of Massachusetts. We were talking about New England issues and things like that. And then, of course, my brother, with the sports pages, he was just obsessed with the Red Sox, the Bruins, the Celtics, everything. But now we have this internet culture, and almost all news stories become national news stories very quickly. So I think there's major differences between, obviously you got national, and they're covering mostly now it's politics. Everything seems to be about politics. Even if it's a story about farming, it's how is farming going to affect the election. If it's COVID, it's what's COVID doing as far as the Democrats versus the Republicans. So I would say that the local news reporting is something that there's a great hunger for, but there are not essentially, when you talk supply and demand, there are not enough consumers of local news. People get up, they want to look at Twitter, they want to see what Kanye said, they want to see what President Trump said, and they don't have as much focus on their local community. So I think that the problem, if you're talking about a local reporter, the big difference is he's going to have trouble, he or she, they're going to have trouble getting their message out because there's not a lot of people with our limited time, our limited focus. Not enough people are focusing on their community.
Mhm. So when you are on Fox, what do you think the line is, or where do you think the line is between opinion and news, and how do you keep them separate?
Well, it's interesting because at Fox News, they keep them separate for us. The news division is run by a different person than the opinion division. They have essentially, they're two separate companies. So we know who we are. Me and Greg Gutfeld, we see each other in the hallways, or we hang out in our little pod at the office when we were in the office. Now we're all home. But Greg Gutfeld and I are opinion guys. He's on the 5, and we're both kind of, in the world, we come from the world of comedy, and we're a little more irreverent. So we're different from most of the Fox News people. But someone like Sean Hannity, obviously he's opinion. Tucker Carlson, he gives his opinion on his show. He has a different producer than Brett Baer. Brett Baer is the news division. So the other cable outlets, it's all mixed together. You have someone like, this is what I'm obviously pro Fox News because I'm there and I see the way it works, but they're very explicit about the way that they divide the news teams. And you don't have someone like, you got Laura Ingraham. She has a very different function at the network than someone like, you would say, I already mentioned Brett Baer, but you have someone like Chris Wallace, who's on the news division. And if he is going to give his opinion on Fox News Sunday or something like that, they'll say, let's do an analysis. And so they'll get their news anchors to give their analysis, but rarely do they involve the news anchors in partisan politics. Whereas you definitely know the partisan affiliation of Sean Hannity. There's no question about it. you can see it on his hat, you know? So the Fox News, even though I think there's an impression out there among certain people that Fox News is this, opinionated network, or they might call it biased from their point of view. They definitely have a division between the news and the opinion. And I think that's something that I don't know. I'm not at CNN, but certainly when I watch their network, I don't know if I'm getting a wrong impression of it, but I don't know. Chris Cuomo has essentially a news show. He calls himself a newsman. Someone like Anderson Cooper calls himself a newsman, but their shows are just as opinionated as Sean Hannity. So I feel like they don't do as good of a job. And you might get a different opinion from someone at CNN, but I don't know where the line is at some of the other networks, but certainly, at least from my perspective, the line's pretty clear at Fox.
Okay, thank you. So when you wake up in the morning and you get the pop-up notifications on your phone, where do you get your news from?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's changing all the time.
Mhm.
And, it used to be I would have certain newspapers I would go to. That was in the early days of the internet, certain trusted news sources. Now there's so many news aggregators that even though I find social media very annoying and not the best way to get my news, it ends up being oftentimes the way I get the news. So I like to avoid the news while I have my coffee, and then at some point I put the coffee down and I say, okay, it's time to face the stress of the day, and I'll open up Twitter. I want to see, because it's basically a Trump thing. What did Trump tweet, and how's the media reacting to it? So Twitter, even though it's full of a lot of nonsense and silliness, and obviously a lot of bad feelings and partisan anger and things like that. It's also a very simple way to get what seems to be trending. So I go with Twitter, go with the headlines. I don't really use Facebook the way I used to. For me, Facebook used to have more of a trending news um, topics that were available. Now, when I go onto Facebook, it really is just people yelling at each other and posting angry memes. So I've been avoiding Facebook lately with the news. That may change if they change their algorithms or change the way they do things. But from my perspective as a news consumer, Facebook has been, maybe purposefully, they're getting out of the headline business and getting more into the I guess the passionate, what would you say? It's more people giving their perspective. It's like the the news division versus the opinion division. Facebook is all opinion now. That may just be my feed, but that's the way it's working out. I also have a bunch of blogs that I still trust. It's funny using the word blog because no one really talks about blogging anymore. That's something that was like back in the early 2000s. Everyone was blogging and you had your trusted blogs. I still read every day. It's from the Midwest, the Powerline blog. Powerline blog is the name of it, and it's three different contributors from the Midwest, and they all kind of have an interesting sensibility and an interesting way to aggregate their stories. So each one of them, I think it's three guys, mainly three guys. There may be more. They put their favorite stories up there and comment on them. So that's a great blog to go to. I used to go to Drudge Report. Drudge Report is very, very, obviously very, very tabloidy. And I guess in these hot times, I have to avoid it. It's too stressful for me. And then I obviously go to the big names, Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. So I would say Twitter, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and then a couple of other trusted blogs from people that I'm interested in.
So when you take in those news outlets, how do you form your opinion on certain topics as they come through?
Well, it's not so hard today because everything is almost divided into opinion. And so when I look at news stories now, I'm very skeptical from a narrative point of view. I tend to look at a story and immediately I say, okay, where are they coming from in this? And so I guess it's, at my age, I tend to have my opinions and I'm just trying to look for clarity now. So I know where I stand on issues. And then when a story comes up, I normally have an opinion. Say, let's take a story. Let's take an example. with the border. Say you have a border issue. I see a lot of border stories because my mother lives down in Arizona near the border. So that's a kind of an interesting issue to me. The border is there's not really one perspective on a border issue. If you have, say, a caravan of people who are trying to come across the border, you have people who are trying to come across the border into the US and seek refugee status, say, you've got an issue here that is, there's two things. Say there's security is an issue. So the US border security, that is kind of an overarching issue when you're talking about people coming across the border. And then you have a humanitarian issue, and you've got, okay, people who are suffering and what's being done about their suffering. Those are two different things, but if you're covering the border, usually you are reporting on it from either a narrative of humanitarian, human suffering, or border security. It's hard to mix those two things together. So I'll look at a story and it will say, crisis on the border, and then you read it, and it's coming from the perspective of people who are maybe, non-governmental organizations who are working on the border to alleviate suffering. And so the reporter is writing all about the human suffering. Now, when I'm done with that article, I might learn about the human suffering and I might have a perspective on that. And then I want to seek out a different perspective on border security because that's an issue that wasn't covered in that article. So it's almost like I look at a story, I see the narrative, and then if I want to be honest with myself, I say, okay, there's another narrative from this because it's not just, there are more issues on the border than human suffering. So I need to get a different perspective on this from, excuse me, I might have went out there. Did you see that?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So so it's almost like in order to form my opinion, I'm going to have to go to several news sources.
Gotcha. Okay, so now let's get into the nitty gritty of this. We conducted a survey, me and my group, where we asked a bunch of college students about journalism and trust and their opinions on different topics. So of the 107 responses we got, only 8 people said that Fox News was considered trustworthy, and 3 people said that CNN was.
Yeah.
And just over a third of people said Fox was untrustworthy, and almost half for CNN. Why do you think so many young adults don't trust traditional and mainstream news outlets?
I think because news, especially televised media, television and radio, modern news media has gone into the opinion business. And I think people, they can obviously see that. They see a show and they say, they might see Sean Hannity's show, clearly an opinion show. And they say, well, that guy's coming from that perspective. Then they might turn on CNN and they see a show like I was mentioning before, Anderson Cooper. Now, Anderson Cooper is a news show, but it's clear he has an opinion and it's clear you're hearing it from him. People realize they know they're not getting an objective view. They know they're getting an opinionated view. So they say, well, I can't really trust this as purely a factual source. I'm obviously getting a biased opinion from this person. So it's going to lead to a breakdown in trust. And then they'll say the problem there comes with, I think it all comes from a clarity. Like you said to me, how are things divided at Fox News? Well, Fox tries to be clear about which is news and which is opinion. And Fox knows that even their news division has an editorial slant because they might cover a story. Like I said, I was just talking about the border. Fox might cover that story on the border from a security point of view because a lot of their viewers, that's the narrative that they're looking for is the security angle. And then CNN is going to cover it from the humanitarian angle because that's what their viewers are looking for. People know that because they tune to CNN. And some people who are all about the CNN view will just watch CNN all the time. People who are all about the perspective that Fox is showing them, they'll watch that all the time. Other people will say, I want to get both perspectives. They go and they look at this angle. They look at this angle. Then they watch an opinion show where somebody's yelling about this angle. They watch another opinion show and someone's yelling about this angle. And they start to say, it's all narrative. So the news stories and the opinion shows all are coming at, if you look at it as a spotlight, this news organization is shining a spotlight from this direction on the story, and it's casting a shadow in a certain shape. This one is shining it on this one, and it's casting that shape. And people know, okay, there's two different shapes here. So the idea that there's some objective truth to a story, it's pretty fuzzy. So I'm going to have to either I'm going to have to lose trust in the media. That's your choice. You can either choose to lose trust in the media. You can either trust just one source that agrees with you already, or you got a lot of homework ahead of you, just feasting on a huge diet of media and trying to glean the truth from all of that. It's kind of exhausting, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in that same survey, roughly 75% of people we surveyed said that they trust their local media more than national media, which you kind of touched on earlier.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I think a lot of it has to do with the overarching left-right divide in the country, Democrat, Republican. That's what you hear all the time. Democrats think this, Republicans think this. Trump thinks this, Nancy Pelosi thinks this. It's a real divide, and people have come down on either side of the divide. In your local town, it's not that divided. You know, you don't have a Democrat, a solid Democrat view of whether Joe's Diner should be able to expand his expand his dining room to have more customers, or whether you should have an outdoor concert on the local green. But when you see those stories in the local newspaper, you're going to get a more or a less biased take on these stories. People still have their opinions. You start to know in your hometown, you know who is for school issues, who's for concentrating on funding the schools, and who is more concentrating on funding the local businesses or expanding the industrial base of the town. You know all of these issues, but it's not a strict left-right divide. So the kind of trust that they've lost in the national media, they haven't lost the trust in the local media that way.
Gotcha. So you touched on it a little earlier as well. Do you think that people's criticisms of Fox and CNN for being biased are fair?
Yeah, I do. And I think that the issue isn't whether they are fair, because they're not fair. A lot of them are doing opinion programming. So fairness is kind of out the window. I always like to talk about the news media in terms of narratives. What narratives are they dwelling on? And I think all television news dwells a little heavily on the narratives that their audience wants to hear. They're just guided that way by their audience because they know what their viewers want to watch. So instead of the idea of being unbiased, which is very difficult, I think it is being clear about what your narrative is. And so that's what I think Fox News does. I'm always defending Fox for being very clear about what their opinion is, or who their opinion personalities are, and who their news personalities are. And I think if more people were like that, Fox could even be more clear about that. I mean, they could have a little O in the corner of the screen when they had an opinion show on, and then they could have an N on their news. It would be even more clear. And definitely, I think on some of the other cable networks like MSNBC and CNN, they could definitely, I think, be more honest about which shows are pushing opinion and which shows are pushing so-called facts. But I think that's the first time I mentioned the word facts, because I don't like the word. People say, well, here we deal in facts. And facts aren't really journalism. You know, journalism is stories. So when you're telling a story, there is a narrative element to it, and there is a bias in what you want to focus on. In the same way that there's when you're writing a novel, you have a bias on which character you're going to focus on. Otherwise, it would just be a novel about a bunch of people wandering around. So stories are inherently narrative based. So when you take a bunch of facts and you connect them and make a story, you're connecting them like a connect the dot drawing. You're drawing a picture. The problem with the media isn't the fact that they are drawing pictures instead of just giving us facts. The problem is they're not admitting that they're drawing a picture for us. And I think a more responsible news media would say, here's the picture we're drawing for you, and it's based on the following facts. So, if every once in a while in cable news you backed up and you had a split screen and you had the facts bulleted out on one side, and then you had the story on the other side, people would say, "Oh, I see where we're going with this," and so perhaps that would be a good way for people to almost pull the facts out of the narrative, and then they could draw their own story. But again, it requires a lot of work. People like to they don't want to have to cook the meal. They're there to dine on it. So the cable news is giving them what they want. They're drawing them the picture. The people are looking at the picture, and so if we want news to be more fair as consumers, we have to be ready to do the hard work, and we're going to have to do more reading, do more research, and do more work on our own.
Mhm. So how do you think biased news feeds into the lack of trust among consumers?
I think it makes people. It comes from fear. I think that there's an old saying in TV news: if it bleeds, it leads. Because people they may not like to see strife, murder, disaster, but they're drawn to that, and we know that from the internet, the things that get clicks, right? So the media feeds on people's fears because it's easier to get viewers when you show them something scary or something upsetting. And by scary, I don't just mean, oh, a hurricane is coming, but scary, oh, this party is going to take over the country and it's going to go in this direction. And if it does, your life's going down the tubes. So it's very easy to scare people with just run-of-the-mill political talk. And that's what I think a lot of these cable channels do. People know they're being scared. And as a result, they know they're being manipulated. And then they get angry because they're so nervous all the time, and then they get in a fight with their spouse or they yell at their kids, and then they turn and they say, you know why I'm so angry all the time? That stupid box is scaring me. And then so they're angry at the news media. So in some way you can stay angry at the news media, or you can turn down the temperature a little bit, or you can realize what they're doing. If you know they're scaring you, that's the first step in not being scared.
I like that. I like that. Okay, so last question. When you are preparing for your show and when you're actually doing it, what are some things that you do to gain the trust of your audience?
Well, I've always gained trust of my audience the same way I do as a stand-up comedian. I'm a rare bird in the world of cable news in that I came from stand-up comedy. That's not unheard of. Dennis Miller was a guy who came from Saturday Night Live, and then he was working on Fox News, and he does a lot of politics in his act now. Someone like Bill Maher is a comedian who went into essentially political opinion and things like that. So it happens, but I gain trust with an audience as a stand-up comedian by making them laugh and by lightening things up. And so I like to get on stage. In the world of stand-up comedy, people are very nervous. Audiences are nervous when a new comedian takes the stage. Oh, is this guy going to be good? Is this woman going to be funny? And are they going to embarrass me? I'm here with my girlfriend or my wife at the table. I hope this goes well. Everyone's stressed out. And the comedian's stressed out because it's stressful being a comedian and having to impress an audience. So you start by establishing trust with the audience, lightening things up, showing them that you're in charge, you're confident, you do have an act. Maybe you make a joke and you get a laugh, and that breaks the ice. And then you basically, during your time on stage, a lot of it's not just telling jokes, it's establishing a rapport with the audience and letting them know everything's going to be okay. As long as I'm on the stage, we are going to have a good time. And then people relax and they laugh. So I treat it that way with the news. And I think that's why Fox News, they don't use me for the headline stuff. It's not breaking news. Here's Tom Shillue. they tend to have me on at the end of their show. They call it the D block, the E block, you know, because it goes A, B, C, D, E. When you get into after the C block, the D and the E block is those kind of silly stories at the end of the show. Sometimes they're feel good. Sometimes they're, oh, did you see what this celebrity said? Let's talk to Tom Shillue. So I feel like I have an easier rapport in trust with the audience because people know me as the guy who lightens things up. So sometimes when I am talking about a hot button issue or I'm talking about politics, people are more inclined to say, oh, like this guy's not really that, you know, he's the funny guy. So why don't I listen to what he has to say? So I think that humor helps establish trust because people think this guy's not going to hurt anybody. He's just a comedian anyway. So maybe I'll just listen to what he has to say, as opposed to someone who you might have just seen at a debate getting in a fight with one of the candidates, or you know, who people perceive as being very partisan. So I think lightening it up with humor has always been the way I establish trust. And I think it's a good way also for Fox. I think that's why they like having me around. That not all their personalities are serious all the time and talking about the Armageddon is coming. You know, the Democrats are taking away your rights. The Republicans are, you know, being mean. I'm able to have a lighter view on the news, and I think Fox News likes having that around.
And just to bounce off of that really quick, how would you say the news guys then balance that as well, trying to gain the trust of their audience?
Ask me that question again.
How do you think the news guys? So you said that you are one of the opinion guys on Fox. How would you say the news anchors try to gain the trust of their audience?
I think theirs is a more of a long game. I'm going to use Brett Baer as an example. Very trusted guy. He's on at 6 o'clock. Okay. I think he gains the trust of the audience by being, by having a calm demeanor, by having a kind of an old school approach to the news, the way that he grew up with the guys like Walter Cronkite. They always talked in a soft voice, and usually they weren't particularly angry. They weren't particularly happy. They weren't particularly silly. They approached the news in a very somber way. So someone like Brett Baer I think he's going to play the long game with his audience. He's going to report the news every day. If he gets kind of caught in bias in some way, if he's showing his opinion, he might apologize for it. I've seen Brett Baer apologize. You know, in the last story we said this and we got it wrong, and you know, we'll try to do better. So showing your work. That is, you know, where did you get this? Where'd you get this story? Who reported it? That's why the news people, they often say, let's go to Catherine Herridge with the report. And they go and they ask them, you know, they kind of take the burden off themselves. You know, I'm not telling you this. My reporter's telling you that. So there's a way that old school media, where a lot of times they make fun of it because it's, oh, that's, you know, you look at the way the news is set up, and sometimes it seems a little staid, a little old fashioned. But there's a reason those news protocols were put in place. That was to establish trust. You had an anchor, and he wasn't just reading a story off a news sheet. He got that story because there's a reporter out in the street who's saying, I'm here, and that building's on fire. You can trust me. So he uses his staff to gain trust. He uses his attitude to gain trust, in that he keeps a calm demeanor, and he tries not to show his bias, even if it might be there, because we all have opinions. And then if he gets something wrong, he'll admit it. So I think he uses all of those things to gain trust with his audience. And I think it'd be interesting if Brett heard me say that, because I would love to get his take on whether he agrees with that. But I think that's a pretty good, you know, 3 bullet points, 3 ways that he establishes trust with the audience.
Well, thank you very much. I understand you're a very busy man, so thank you for taking time out of your day to
Back to my coffee.
So, thank you.
All right, Joseph. Thanks, man. Bye-bye.